Hi everybody, this is a very short slide presentation on how to adopt in Kenya. We do realize that a lot of people who would want to do an adoption do not actually know how to go about the adoption process in Kenya. Thus, they fall into the hands of a lot of rogue agencies and children's homes who even extort a lot of money from them just because they do not know the procedure and processes of adoption in Kenya. This short slide presentation PowerPoint is intended to give a rough outline on what you need to expect when contemplating an adoption in Kenya and how this process works from the beginning to the end. First and foremost, adoptions are governed by the Children's Act 2001. And under the Children's Act, we have the adoption regulations, which provide for the procedure for adoption. If you have time, you can be able to take your time to be able to actually look at this Children's Act and be able to read for yourself and enlighten yourself about how adoption is done in Kenya. So we have various preliminaries or what we would call prerequisites before an adoption is done. First and foremost, the child who is to be adopted must be at least 6 weeks old. This is for just expediency purposes, for the best interest of the child. A child needs to be 6 weeks old. Secondly, the child must have been declared free for adoption by an adoption society. I will give a little bit of an explanation for this. Sometimes we have what is called a kinship adoption, and that is where a child is placed for or a person wants to adopt a relative. Maybe the child's parents died and so the relatives want to adopt. The child must be at least 6 weeks old and declared free for adoption by an adoption society. Third, the applicant must be above 25 years of age and below 65 years of age. This as well is simply for the best interest of the child. And lastly, the applicant must be at least 21 years older than the child. So these are just some preliminaries that you need to know while you are thinking about doing an adoption. So there are 3 stages, and we'll talk about the first stage, and that is where you use an adoption agency. It's called the adoption agency stage. Now, all adoptions under the Children's Act must be processed through a licensed adoption agency. You don't just walk into a children's home and then say you want to adopt a child, and a children's home cannot give you a child for adoption. It's only a licensed adoption agency that can be able to do that. So the first step is visiting the adoption agency for an orientation meeting where you fill an application form, you provide identification documents, that is your ID, passport if you do have, and relevant documents that they may need. You provide a certificate of good conduct. This is usually gotten from the Directorate of Criminal Investigation just to show that you do not have any prior criminal history that will be an endangerment to the child. Once you fill the form and everything else is done, and everything that you tick all boxes, you then move to a home visit, which is scheduled by a social worker from the what is called a case committee that is set aside by the adoption agency to verify and assess your case for an adoption. So the social worker comes to your home and does an interview for you and for anybody else you live with, and just make sure that you have the capability to provide a good home for the child. Then once that is done, that is part of the social inquiry. Many questions may be asked, and you may be asked to maybe provide another relative or friend who can vouch for you, and all circumstances as determined by the social worker are taken into consideration before a decision on whether you as the applicant are suitable or not to adopt. Once that stage is done, we come to the second stage, and this is the stage called the matching and placement stage. That is where you, the applicant, are matched with a child for adoption. You do not get to choose the child you want to adopt. The Adoption Society matches you with a child that they have determined. This is of course, not the case where it's a kinship adoption where you're adopting a child who is your relative, but this is what we would call a stranger adoption. A matching is done. They match a child who is most suitable to you and who is most resembling you in all aspects. Then there is a mandatory placement for 3 months for purposes of bonding, and this is supervised by the social worker before giving final approval to adopt by the Adoption Society. Lastly, after all this is done, is the last stage, which is called the court process, where you as the applicant, you file a petition for adoption at the High Court of Kenya, Family Division. Then the court will provide somebody called a guardian ad litem for the child. This is a neutral person who is supposed to take care of the interests of the child before an adoption is completed. And once the court is satisfied that all requirements are met, it makes an adoption order, which is then registered in an adoption register, and that concludes the adoption process. I'd like to mention at this point that it is very important to follow this process in order to avoid heartaches, disappointments, extortion from rogue agencies that may want to capitalize on your lack of knowledge on this process to get money from you, and that is not gonna be good. Once the court, you've done all this process, you've gone to an adoption society or an adoption agency, and it has gone through the process, and you've gone all the way to the High Court, and you've been given an adoption order, you become the parent of the. For any questions on the adoption process or anything related to that, feel free to reach out to us at BEGI'S Law Offices and Chambers, 2nd floor Bishop's Garden Towers, First Ngong Avenue, Nairobi. Our phone number is 254-723-313-833, and our email address, you can reach me through elvisabenga@begislaw.com. We hope that you found this very short presentation to be very useful to you. Enjoy yourself and seriously consider adopting a child. Goodbye.